America expected its warship to be untouchable. Instead, missiles struck the USS Abraham Lincoln in one of the most dramatic escalations this conflict has produced. For decades, American aircraft carriers have functioned as the most powerful symbol of U.S. military dominance in any theater of war. They are not simply weapons. They are warnings. Their presence in a region sends a message that no government can ignore. And for that reason, no adversary has dared to strike one in generations. Until now. Within minutes of the first reports emerging, Washington went quiet. The Pentagon issued no statement. The White House made no comment. And somewhere in an undisclosed location, Netanyahu reportedly went dark entirely. The silence spoke louder than any missile. Two stories are now circulating, and both cannot be true. According to sources close to the U.S. defense establishment, the strike caused limited structural damage. American officials are reportedly describing the incident as a calculated provocation rather than a decisive military blow. The carrier, they insist, remains fully operational. Its aircraft are still flying. Its crew is still functioning. Washington wants the world to believe that nothing fundamental has changed. Tehran tells a completely different story. Iranian state media is reporting that the strike directly targeted the carrier's command and communication infrastructure. According to their account, the missile penetrated the outer defensive perimeter of one of the most heavily protected vessels in the U.S. Navy. Iranian officials are framing the strike not as a provocation, but as a demonstration. Proof, they argue, that American military power in the region is no longer beyond reach. Two governments, two completely different versions of reality. And in the space between those two versions, something deeply dangerous is forming, because if Iran has genuinely demonstrated the ability to hit a U.S. carrier, the entire strategic balance of this conflict has shifted overnight, and Washington knows it. Only 72 hours before the strike, the USS Abraham Lincoln was not supposed to be in that position at all. The carrier group had been repositioned quietly, moving deeper into the Gulf region as part of what Pentagon officials described as a routine deterrence operation. No formal announcement was made. No press briefing was scheduled. The movement was designed to send a signal without triggering a public response. But signals in wartime are rarely received the way they are intended. Iranian surveillance assets, according to regional intelligence analysts, had been tracking the carrier group's movements for several days. The repositioning was not a surprise to Tehran. It was reportedly anticipated, and preparations were already underway. Then everything changed. In the early hours of the morning, radar systems aboard the carrier group detected an incoming threat. What followed happened faster than most public accounts have suggested. Defense systems were activated, countermeasures were deployed, and yet something got through. Exactly what got through remains disputed. The type of missile, the point of impact, the extent of the damage, all of it is currently buried under layers of official silence and competing claims. What is not disputed is this: an Iranian weapon reached an American warship. And that fact alone has rewritten the assumptions that both sides were operating under. In the hours following the strike, the U.S. military response was notable not for what it did, but for what it did not do. No immediate retaliatory strike was launched. No emergency naval movement was publicly confirmed. The carrier group's exact status remains officially undisclosed. Pentagon briefings scheduled for that morning were quietly postponed without explanation. According to defense analysts monitoring the situation, this restraint is not weakness. It is calculation. A retaliatory strike launched in anger without full intelligence on Iranian positions carries enormous risks of escalation that Washington is not yet prepared to absorb. But Tehran is reading the silence very differently. Iranian military officials are reportedly interpreting the lack of immediate U.S. response as confirmation that the strike achieved its intended psychological effect. State media is framing American restraint not as strategic patience, but as hesitation. And in the information war that runs parallel to every military conflict, hesitation is indistinguishable from fear. What we know so far is this: the strike involved at least one missile that penetrated the defensive envelope of the carrier group. Sources suggest it may have been a modified anti-ship ballistic missile, a category of weapon that the U.S. Navy has been quietly wargaming against for years. Whether the Abraham Lincoln is genuinely operational or whether that claim is itself part of the information management strategy coming out of Washington remains impossible to verify from the outside. Both sides are now engaged in a fierce battle over perception. And in modern warfare, controlling that narrative can be almost as consequential as the outcome on the battlefield itself. The moment news of the strike began circulating in financial markets, the reaction was immediate. Oil prices moved sharply upward within the first 30 minutes of trading. Insurance underwriters covering commercial vessels operating anywhere near the Gulf region began reassessing risk exposure in real time. Several major shipping companies quietly rerouted vessels that had been scheduled to transit the Strait of Hormuz within the next 48 hours. Because what the strike on the Abraham Lincoln has done, beyond its military implications, is send a message to every cargo captain, every energy trader, and every finance minister watching this conflict from a distance. If Iran can hit a U.S. carrier, it can hit anything moving through those waters. The Strait of Hormuz remains the single most critical choke point in the global energy system. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow corridor every single day. Iran sits directly on its northern coast, and the country has spent years quietly developing the naval and missile capabilities needed to make that strait ungovernable if it chooses to do so. The consequences of even a partial disruption would not remain confined to the Gulf region. They would move through energy markets, supply chains, and national economies at a speed that no government would be fully prepared to absorb. The strike on the Abraham Lincoln was a military event. What follows may become an economic crisis. Inside Washington, the political fallout from the strike is already beginning to reshape the landscape. President Trump, who had publicly projected confidence in American military deterrence only days before the incident, has not appeared before cameras since the reports emerged. Senior administration officials are speaking only on background. And the carefully constructed narrative that U.S. forces were operating from a position of unchallenged strength has developed a visible crack. Netanyahu's situation is arguably more complicated. Israel has been deeply embedded in the strategic logic of this confrontation from the beginning. Israeli intelligence has reportedly been sharing targeting data with American forces. Israeli officials have publicly celebrated several of the strikes on Iranian military infrastructure. The war, from Jerusalem's perspective, has been unfolding largely as intended. But a successful Iranian strike on a U.S. carrier changes the calculus entirely. If America's appetite for continued engagement begins to waver, Israel finds itself in a significantly more exposed position. The military partnership that has defined this conflict could face its first serious internal stress. And reports emerging from regional diplomatic sources suggest that private conversations between Washington and Jerusalem in the hours following the strike have been tense in ways that public statements are not yet reflecting. Whatever is being said behind closed doors, the public silence from both capitals is telling a story of its own. Beyond Washington and Tehran, the strike on the Abraham Lincoln is being watched with extraordinary intensity by governments that have not yet publicly entered this conflict. In Moscow, intelligence analysts suggest that Russian officials received reports of the strike before Western media had confirmed the incident. The speed of that information flow is itself significant. It points toward intelligence sharing arrangements between Russia and Iran that go considerably deeper than either government has publicly acknowledged. In Beijing, Chinese foreign ministry officials issued a carefully worded statement calling for restraint. But intelligence officials monitoring Chinese naval movements in the broader Indo-Pacific region have noted repositioning activity in the days surrounding the strike that analysts are not yet able to fully explain. Meanwhile, across the Gulf states, governments that have spent months carefully managing their public neutrality are now facing internal pressure to make choices they have been deliberately avoiding. Saudi Arabia has not commented. The UAE has not commented. Qatar, which hosts the largest U.S. airbase in the Middle East, has gone notably quiet. And in European capitals, emergency consultations are reportedly underway behind closed doors. NATO members are quietly assessing what their treaty obligations might require if the situation continues to escalate. The strike on one warship has activated alarm systems across an entire global order that was already under extraordinary strain. And the chain reactions now unfolding are moving faster than any diplomatic framework currently exists to contain them. For now, the USS Abraham Lincoln remains somewhere in the Gulf. Its exact status is unknown. Its next orders are classified. And the decision that will define what this conflict becomes next is being made in rooms that no camera will ever enter. Iran has demonstrated something that changes this war permanently. America has absorbed a blow it has not yet publicly acknowledged, and the world is waiting to find out whether what comes next is a calculated response or an escalation that no one will be able to walk back. The question now is not whether this conflict will reach a point of no return. The question is whether it already has, and when the answer becomes clear, the world will not be ready